My name is Abby Backen, and I am professor and chair of the Department of Social Justice Education at Boise at University of Toronto. And I'm pleased and honored to be able to chair this session today on the topic of reassessing the Russian Revolution. I think the Russian Revolution is actually the reason why we're having a conference, because it's 100 years since the Russian Revolution, and it's a moment to think about revolutions in general. So I'm really pleased to have three panelists, all of whom I have known and worked with over many years, so this is really a treat for me, who are going to be speaking. So I'm going to introduce the three speakers together. Each of them will be speaking for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. So first we'll be hearing from David Camfield, who is Associate Professor of Sociology and Labor Studies, and he's going to be addressing the question of social revolution and counter-revolution in Russia. This will be followed by Paul Kellogg at the University of Athabasca. He's Associate Professor in the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies, and he's speaking on the topic of Stalinism and counter-revolution, reflections on Trotsky's final book. Then John Riddell, do I have this correct? I'm just reading from the program, but I am quite sure I've got this wrong, and John has changed his title. So here we go. So Paul is actually speaking on self-emancipation in the early Communist International.
No. You got mine right. Just read off John's.
Okay. I'm reading off the program. I have one job. I'm doing my best. John Riddell is a Marxist scholar. He's affiliated to the Department of Social Justice Education at the University of Toronto. And his topic, the title is Reassessing Trotsky's Biography of Stalin. So, as I understand it, David will be speaking first, and then Paul and John are in a bit of a dialogue about some questions of interpretations. So, we'll give an opportunity for either or both of them to respond to each other for points of clarification or discussion in terms of that exchange. I am asked, as chair and discussant, to say a few words, which will be brief, just to get you folks started. I realize we're in a little bit of a curious venue for a socialist conference. We are in a chapel, and the acoustics are not ideal. We are being filmed, and I appreciate that. But maybe people could just, when we get to discussion, make sure that you speak articulately, and we can all hear what your comments are. So without further ado, we'll get started with David.
How's that for volume? Yeah? Not, how's this? Is that better? Okay, so my paper is on revolution and counter-revolution in Russia between 1917 and 1928. And so I've taken the centenary of the Russian Revolution as an occasion to revisit the world historical events of the Russian Revolution from a historical materialist perspective, because I've been dissatisfied with assumptions that are often made about the early years of the Bolshevik regime by sympathetic writers. I mean, I include myself in that group. But I'm quite dissatisfied with. I've been quite dissatisfied with a lot of the analysis of how the passage from Soviet democracy in 1917 to a new ruling class by the late 1920s unfolded. So I'm going to be arguing in defense of two claims. The first is that 1917 saw a profoundly democratic socialist revolution in Russia, one which established working class rule and initiated a transition towards, or in the direction of socialism. This is obviously not an original argument, but it's essential, I think, to rehearse it because of the stubbornly common belief that the October Revolution was merely a coup. But the second claim is that by late 1918, working class rule had been replaced by the rule of a leadership layer of the working class, which improvised a fragile state to defend the revolution. But this state was, I would argue, a surplus extracting state of proletarian origin, certainly not what has often been called a worker state. By the late 1920s, the layer that controlled the state had become a new ruling class, and that signified the triumph of a counter-revolution definitively ending the rupture with class society which had been initiated in 1917. The paper deliberately does not address the question of the character of the mode of production after the late 1920s. That's another debate for another time, the more classical Russian question. So my argument is that the decisive cause of the loss of working class rule and later the development of a new ruling class was material pressures acting first on a working class that was plunged into catastrophic social crisis and war in 1918, and then after the end of the Civil War, material pressures acting on the party-state leadership layer, which was faced with Western European capitalist societies and domestically faced with the classes from which it had to extract surpluses in order to reproduce its rule. Bolshevik ideology did influence developments, but I would argue is not the major cause of either the end of working class rule or the rise of a new ruling class. Because I think that a prerequisite for discussions that would deepen our understanding of the Russian Revolution and its fate is a shared theoretical framework. I think there's less debate about many empirical questions. I'm going to start by actually addressing some theoretical preliminaries. I think most of the disagreements among Marxists about the Russian Revolution are a result of having different theoretical assumptions. So by revolution, in the broadest sense, I simply follow Perry Anderson, understanding it as an episode of convulsive political transformation compressed in time and concentrated in target that has a determinate beginning when the old state apparatus is still intact and a finite end when that apparatus is decisively ended and a new one erected in its stead. Political revolutions are those that happen within a socioeconomic structure, and social revolutions are those which involve a change from one socioeconomic structure to another, which means that I would say Anderson's wrong to insist that a revolution ends when a new state is erected, since a political revolution might change who controls the state without fundamentally restructuring the state. But we need to distinguish a social revolution from the longer processes of transition between modes of production, which may or may not involve a social revolution. By a socialist revolution, I'm referring to a specific kind of social revolution, one which carries out a rupture with the capitalist mode of production and starts the transition towards socialism. Now, what do we mean by socialism? Here, I'm following Paresh Chattopadhyay, who I think quite nicely sums up Marx's view on the subject as describing it as a society of free and associated individuals with social ownership of the means of production without state, commodity production, or wage labor, which Marx called different things at different times, in different texts using terms such as communism, socialism, the Republic of Labor, a society of free and associated producers, or simply association, cooperative society, or the reunion of free individuals. So I should underline this is quite different from how some Marxists have used the term socialism as referring to some kind of a separately demarcated early stage in the transition to communism, as equivalent to what Marx in the Critique of the Gotha program calls the first phase of communist society, as it is when it's just emerged after the prolonged birth pangs from capitalist society. So the essential feature of a socialist revolution, I would argue, is that it establishes working class rule, which Marx described in different ways, using terms such as conquest of political power by the proletariat, a worker state, the political ascendancy or sway of the proletariat, the rule of the proletariat, or the dictatorship of the proletariat, really all interchangeably. The key here is that the working class becomes the dominant class in society. Capitalist class rule can be exercised through different political forms, from fascism through to democratic republican welfare states. Working class rule is different. It can only exist in the form of democratic control over the political and economic dimensions of society by the working class itself. As Joseph Carter once put it quite simply, without political power, the working class cannot be the ruling class in any sense. So I'm not making an argument from authority, but for what it's worth, I think this was also Marx's view. So I contend that working class rule is a necessary condition for any progress in a transition towards socialism. Only the agency of the direct producers themselves can reconstruct society in ways which begin to lay the basis for socialism, a society of freely associated producers. no other group's activity can be a substitute for the self-activity of the working class in creating socialism. Many things could be done by others on behalf of the working class, but not movement towards socialism. And finally, in terms of just conceptual clarification, by counter-revolution, I really mean the negation of the rupture with class society, initiating a process of transition towards socialism that's been begun by a socialist revolution. Now, before I proceed to talk about Russia, I want to just raise and respond to one common objection to the position that I'm articulating here. And that objection is, well, we know that the USSR in the 1920s and later was in transition to socialism. Even after some particular point, socialism was no longer being built, and therefore the theory must be wrong. And this is an objection which I reject, since it rests on an assumption, an a priori assumption, that the USSR was in fact in transition to socialism. I think this is only possible to maintain if we believe that working class rule is optional for a transition to socialism, or if we redefine working class rule to mean something other than workers actually democratically having power in society. Some kind of position that the working class can rule without exercising political power. And also it requires jettisoning or abandoning the role of the self-determining agency of the working class in the reconstruction of society in the direction of socialism. All right, so 1917, what kind of revolution? The February Revolution shook but did not dismantle the Tsarist state. There was then, as we know, an extraordinary wave of self-activity and self-organization and politicization in the working class, and to a lesser extent among the peasantry. Through the year of 1917, peasant direct action escalated with the seizure and redistribution of property. Gender and national oppression were rattled by the self-activity of women and oppressed nations. The Soviets, factory soldiers and sailors committees, and other forms of grassroots democracy represented a dual power, both in the political sphere, counterposed against the provisional government, and the economic sphere, where they confronted capitalist power. The events of 1917 have been chronicled brilliantly in China Miéville's recent narrative history, October. And so through that year, the provisional government lost most of its support among the exploited, who looked to Soviet power to resolve the crisis, and among the exploiters, who sought a dictatorship to restore order. It was thus easily overthrown, and a highly developed and self-organized working class became the dominant class, ruling through new democratic institutions, controlling most social decisions. Now, the historian Lars Lee has recently argued that this revolution was a democratic revolution, but was not socialist, because, in Lee's words, the peasant allies of the proletariat were not ready for socialism. And as an aside, I think that's a true observation. But Lee fails to consider the significance of how the combination of Soviet government and dual power in the workplace challenged the power of capital. What was taking place was a social revolution which broke through the limits of a bourgeois revolution, one which would only promote the development of capitalism, and began to acquire a socialist character. Now, I want to distinguish here between initiating a transition towards socialism and actually starting the socialist reconstruction of society, because I think the Russian Revolution opened the door, but the material potential within Russia alone to begin a transition was extremely minimal, as the Bolsheviks themselves knew in 1917. In terms of explaining what actually took place, clearly the uneven and combined development of capitalism globally made the Russian Revolution possible, but that doesn't explain the actual success of the revolution, and here Bolshevik agency is crucial, since the Bolsheviks were able to understand the course of the class struggle and influence and guide it. And that was only possible because they were united around revolutionary socialist politics, organized largely on a workplace basis, and in 1917 were a highly democratic, decentralized, and open party, contrary to many myths, one that was able to both respond and intervene within the wave of working class self-activity and political debate that took place about how to resolve the social crisis. So that's much less controversial, I think. Turning now to the passage from working class rule to Bolshevik leadership rule, I would argue that what was established in October was working class rule, but in an incomplete form, because in most cases, democratic power was not extended to the sphere of the paid workplace. Worker self-management was rare. this situation lasted until about late 1918. But by the second half of 1918, Soviets had lost their life, their animation, their drive through the militarization of the whole of public life, which, in Marcel Liebman's words, suppressed the Soviets as really functioning bodies. June of 1918 saw sweeping nationalizations, and industry being run by a combination of collegial management boards made up of worker appointees, union officials, and appointees of the regional bodies of the Council of National Economy. Through 1919, 1920, so-called one-man management became increasingly common. Now, all this unfolded in a context of social crisis, food shortages, enormous job losses, and the outbreak of the Civil War disrupting urban society. For example, Petrograd's population fell from 2.3 million or so in the beginning of 1917 to under 1.5 million by June of 1918. But the suspension of Soviet democracy caused working-class rule to metamorphosize into something qualitatively different. The Communist Party, which was very much a segment of the working class, not a force outside of the working class, was in the driver's seat, and its leadership began to rise above the class in whose name it claimed to rule. It improvised a ramshackle and fragile state to wage the Civil War, but the working class did not control the state and in no sense ruled through it. At the same time, the state was not the foundation for any new exploiting class because there was no such class. The state controlled workers' output and appropriated peasants' products, but it was administratively inefficient and it made it quite difficult for the state to actually allocate the surplus. I think if we look a little more carefully at the period of the Civil War, how the production of surplus was socially organized is significant. The state-owned enterprises, yes, and workers did not control the state. But the state had only weak control over workers' labor processes. In spite of the growing militarization of labor, it was quite difficult to fire workers and repression was quite rare. So production was organized neither by the working class nor by capital, but through inefficient state organs that relied on workers' dependence on wages and political exhortation and coercion to appropriate their surplus labor. Meanwhile, the state coercively extracted as much as it could from the peasantry, which had taken control of the land in 1917 in order to feed the cities and the military. But there was no cohesive layer controlling the state, and the state's control over society existed more on paper than in reality. And within the Communist Party, there was still some internal democracy. And I think this can be characterized best as a surplus-extracting state of proletarian origin, a historically unique social form, one which resulted because social supremacy had passed from the working class, which had taken power, into the hands of the leadership of one segment of that class, while that segment only had weak power over society. Fundamentally, the cause of the end of working class rule in 1918 was the catastrophic disruption of urban social life. The Bolshevik leadership's actions made a minor contribution to the loss of working class rule, but the Bolsheviks never had any plan for one-party rule. It's worth reminding ourselves, I think, that the Bolsheviks had never thought that they would be leading a socialist revolution in Russia before a bourgeois revolution and a period of capitalist development had taken place. Until April 1917, they believed they were going to be leading a revolution to overthrow the Tsarist autocracy and replace it with a democratic republic that would then experience further capitalist development. They were unprepared for actually leading a socialist revolution or for the situation created by working class rule. But as Sam Farber has argued, Bolshevik Marxism did have, in his words, democratically deficient conceptions. That is, the Bolsheviks did not see, let's put it a different way, the Bolsheviks believed that working class rule did not require the control of society by the new democratic institutions that they themselves championed in 1917. I mean, the Bolsheviks sincerely believed that the working class was in power because the Bolsheviks were running the state. And they failed to recognize, or most Bolsheviks failed to recognize, the importance of worker self-management and production to working class rule. And just turning now to the years after the Civil War and the transition from the situation I've characterized to the emergence of a new ruling class. I would say from the beginning, starting at the end of 1918, there was a dominant social layer which was not a ruling class, but which had three characteristics of a dominant class. First, it had enough control over the social surplus to give itself social supremacy. Second, it was not subject to democratic control from below by the working class or the peasantry. and third, it was in command of the state's armed forces. The second of these, the absence of democratic control from below, was confirmed by the party's response to the democratic impulses that emerged outside the party after the end of the Civil War. The party's response was to intensify its own monopoly on power. But in the years after the Civil War ended, two changes took place which gave the ruling layer more class-like features. First, the party state leadership layer became more insulated from the party membership. We saw the ban on factions, the Central Committee Secretariat coming to dominate the party and thereby the state, and the use of repression by the top leadership against dissent, for example, against the left opposition in 1923. By this point, the Communist Party, as it had exited the Civil War, was very different from the Bolsheviks of 1917. It was egalitarian, it was self-sacrificing, but it was a militarized vanguardist political force committed to defending the regime as well as to world revolution. However, in the years after the Civil War, the party increasingly became the administrative instrument of a leadership committed to the so-called doctrine of socialism in one country. The other change following from 1923 on was the Central Committee, and in particular the Secretariat, gaining the right to fill important posts by appointment, the birth of the nomenclatura system, and thereby establishing its control over state managers and other party office holders. Late in the 1920s, the ruling layer acquired a sixth class-like feature, and that was the use of the surplus product for purposes alien to and hostile to the interests of the working class in order to reinforce its own rule. During the Civil War, the priorities of the ruling layer had been military victory against the counter-revolution and support for world revolution, and those priorities converged with the interests of the working class and, to a lesser extent, the peasantry. But after the Civil War, the priority became industrialization using the resources available within Russia's borders, ideologically justified by socialism in one country. And the working class was unable to democratically shape the goals, pace, or methods of industrialization that were prioritized from 1925 on, even though individual workers still had strong rights in the workplace. So I would argue that to explain the evolution of a ruling layer into a ruling class in the 1920s, we need to highlight the social pressures acting on the Communist Party leadership as it sought to maintain the surplus-extracting state of proletarian origin against both foreign foes and the classes domestically from which it was compelled to extract surpluses, the working class and the peasantry. The ruling layer sought to develop industry to defend its own rule, believing that the development of state-owned forces of production was the essence of socialist construction. Over time, the dominant elements of the ruling layer sought to turn the party into an instrument to govern Russia and industrialize. It never sought power as an end in itself. Rather, the ruling layer's dominant elements sensed the antagonism between themselves and the working class and peasantry and sought the greatest possible ability to run the state unhindered. I think by the end of the 1920s, we see the dominant group at the top of the party state able to embark on a new course of economic development, carrying out investment in industry on a scale never previously contemplated and bureaucratically directed from the center. This demonstrated that the ruling layer had become a ruling class and a counter-revolution had been completed, eliminating the rupture with class society begun in 1917. I'll just close by observing that I think Bolshevik ideology in 1917 or earlier was largely irrelevant to the evolution of the ruling layer into a ruling class in the 1920s because the primary determinant of what took place was social pressures acting on the communist leadership governing a devastated and isolated country. Also, it's worth underlining that Bolshevik ideology at the end of the Civil War actually bore very little resemblance to the ideology of the Bolsheviks in 1917. But just to close, two elements within Bolshevik thought did facilitate the later rise of a new ruling class to some degree, those being the democratically deficient dimension of Bolshevik politics that I mentioned earlier, and the belief that the development of state industry was the measure of socialist construction, which weakened opposition within the party to the leadership's course from 1923 on, and made it difficult for democratic opponents, democratic oppositionists within Bolshevism to understand the counter-revolution that was unfolding and which had been completed by the late 1920s.
What time am I starting? 11:22. Okay, would you please turn to hymn number 663 in the Joint Anglican United Church Hymn Book, Oh, no, sorry, wrong notes. Excuse me. That's for tomorrow. No, sorry. No, that's just a little joke to start. Very happy to be on this panel with Abby chairing, thank you very much, and John Riddell, who we figured out last night. We first met on a train to Montreal in 1975, briefly, and then reconnected 25 years later. And David, who I've known since the late 1980s. We've been engaged in this conversation for that long, and it'll keep going after this, so it's very fun. It's very fine. I have one very small task in the paper I presented. I want to reintroduce into discussions about the Russian Revolution and its history Trotsky's final book, his biography of Stalin, which has been largely absent from the discussion for a very, very long time. There's a tragic, tragic history to this book. It was the manuscript for this book, which is in two versions here. This is the version I read when I was a kid, my version published in 1977. It was the manuscript that was on his desk when he was assassinated by a cowardly Stalinist agent in 1940, one of the most tragic episodes of the counter-revolution that David Camfield so eloquently described. It was brought to press by the translator hired by Trotsky, Charles Malamuth, brought it to press. He had it finished for press by 1941. It was not published till 1946. The liberal publisher withheld it from press because it was feared that the harsh critique of Stalin in the book would jeopardize the wartime alliance with Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. So the liberals were uncomfortable with the book, but they finally published it in 1946. The Communist Party, of course, detested the book because it exposed very carefully and systematically the venal nature of Stalin's rule in the Soviet Union. And it was condemned far and wide as another example of Trotsky fascism and all the other silly things that were said in the 1930s. It actually wasn't that popular in many Trotskyist circles. Natalia Sedova, Trotsky's widow, warned her comrades about the book, saying, Trotsky's words have been distorted by the translator. Charles Malamuth has distorted it. Be careful, Charles Malamuth was an enemy of Trotsky, and his interpolations and translations are not to be trusted. Finally, last year, we have a complete translation, and it was not all translated. The whole thing was not translated. Last year, Ellen Woods produced an English translation of the entire book, front to back, with everything there, with all interpolations by Charles Malamuth removed. We now have access to the complete manuscript for the first time. I knew this version very well. I was very interested to go back to the new version and read through it, comparing it with the first version. The first conclusion to come to is that the two versions are identical, okay? There is one change, one essential change that has been made. Twice, Charles Malamuth shared a view with Boris Souvarine and some others. They had come to the conclusion that the November or October Revolution, depending on what calendar you use, should be characterized as a coup d'etat. They thought that the February Revolution was a revolution, but November was a coup d'etat. That's a debate and discussion that happens. The word coup d'etat appeared twice in the Malamuth tradition, and that's been removed. But that's the only substantive change. Everything else is identical. And my conclusion was, I think that the upset with this book, even amongst Trotsky's followers, was not because of Charles Malamuth, it was because of Leon Trotsky. That Leon Trotsky's views on the Russian Revolution were in flux. It was an epistemology in flux, cut short, of course, by his assassination. We have no idea where his views would have gone. But they're in flux, and it's an interestingly different emphasis in analysis than you get in his classic books that were talked about in the last session, The Revolution Betrayed in particular. There's two key ways in which you can see his views in flux. First, to try to grapple with the dynamics of Russia in the post-revolutionary era and the rise of Stalin, he deploys overwhelmingly one concept, the concept of the surplus product and the control of the surplus product, which is, of course, an honorable historical materialist category. We look to the control of the surplus product as the way in which class rule is established in society after society. And he deploys this concept on multiple occasions. That's the key thing. He's saying the key thing is the control of the surplus. The second is his uncomfortable analyses of the positive and negative aspects of the Leninist party machine characterized by the Bolshevik Party. He's grappling with those two categories, the surplus and the machine, that are very unusual for Trotsky in the 1930s, and I think that they were anathema to his followers, who were loyal Bolshevik call themselves Bolshevik Leninists, and who were loyal to his earlier ideas of the 1930s, that the essence of the Soviet Union could be determined by the nationalization of state property. Both of these ideas are developed. There's a third book that really should be here, except I don't have it in physical form. I have it in electronic form. There's an earlier book. Trotsky's book was not the first major biography of Stalin to be produced by an historical materialist. The first was Boris Souvarine, who was one of the founders of the French Communist Party in the 1920s, a protege of Vladimir Lenin's when he was a young person. He was secretary to the Communist International, which John Riddell has produced many, many volumes of showing us the documents of it, which is fantastic. He was expelled from the Communist Party of France in 1924. He's famously called by his biographer the first disenchanted communist. He was one of the first people to be officially a quote-unquote Trotskyist, although he's never quite fit into that category. He produced in 1935, in French, he wrote a biography of Stalin that I think Trotsky was, that Souvarine's book is Souvarine is the unacknowledged interlocutor for Trotsky in this book. He's engaged in a discussion with him because many of the themes developed by Trotsky are also in Souvarine's book, in a more graphic form, in a more angular form. And in spite of disagreements, it's interesting, he has sharp disagreements with Souvarine, but he respects him as a scholar. He says that Souvarine is actually an impeccable scholar in the way in which he produces his work. I think that it's interesting that Souvarine's book is translated into English. The English version comes out in 1939 by C.L.R. James. While C.L.R. James was working on his classic Black Jacobin, he's also translating this book from French to English. He's a remarkable man, C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James, of course, and add another figure to the category. Secretary to Trotsky at the time in Mexico for a year and a half or two was Raya Dunayevskaya, and it's C.L.R. James and Raya Dunayevskaya who go on to be associated with the theory of state capitalism that they develop together in the Johnson Forest tendency. It's a whole long story, etc. In other words, Trotsky's in Boris Souvarine. At one point, he thought Russia was state capitalist. By the time he wrote this book, he said, I don't know if Russia's state capitalist or not. I certainly know it's not socialist. I don't know what it is. It's some kind of new exploitative society, but whatever. Trotsky's in a milieu of people who are questioning the foundation of the politics that David also outlined. And I think that this is it's essential to see this as the moment in which his book comes out. It's a book to defend his position, but it's a book that is pressured by these other intellectual critiques that's moving in a particular direction. Okay. Hope and horror are the two things that we have to bear in mind when we study the Russian Revolution in this period. The hope was unbelievable. The hope was, it's actually horror, hope, horror. You have to go. The horror was World War I. The horror was unbelievable. 16 million mostly peasant young men were mobilized into the war. It's an incredible statistic. It was so massive a mobilization that the production of wheat collapsed in the countryside. It didn't completely collapse, but it went down substantially because they didn't have enough laborers in the countryside to actually produce the wheat. 2.5 million died. The horror in the trenches was unimaginable, and the revolution actually begins in a way that we have, I think, forgotten. It didn't really begin in the cities. It began in the countryside. It was the soldiers deserting from the front, first in a trickle, then in a flood, going back home and saying, that's enough. And they went back home with their guns. This was an armed peasantry going back home, began seizing the land. That is, I think, more essential than we've given it credit for. It then becomes intertwines with the revolution in the cities, the great uprising of International Women's Day by our calendar, International Women's Day, uprising of for bread, which becomes a massive strike. So it's horror, World War I, and Tsarism and all the rest of it. The great hope of the uprising. The hope is unbelievable. It just the sense of the potential for freedom, and then the return to horror. The nature of which Boris Souvarine and Leon Trotsky disagree about the nature of that horror, about what causes it, but they both agree it was horrifying. How do you see the horror? It's some kind of a, Trotsky calls it thermidor, using a parallel with the French Revolution. Boris Souvarine calls it a counter-revolution. But they both agree on its essential characteristics. It's horrifying in the countryside. The war on the kulaks, or the forced collectivization of labor, leads to, in complicated circumstances, to horrendous collapse of agriculture production in the 1930s and horrendous death tolls in the countryside. It's horror in the cities in the 1930s. Counter-revolution has to be seen in its totality. I've gone 10 minutes. Okay. Solomon Schwartz has documented the decline in wages in the 1930s. You should look at that book. Number two, Petrograd, 1934, when Sergei Kirov is assassinated. That's used as an excuse to depopulate the opposition in Petrograd. At least 100,000 people are sent to Siberia from Petrograd at the time. Alexander Solzhenitsyn gives a different figure. He says 1 person in 4 in Petrograd is sent to the Gulag in 1934 alone. And then the one figure that you should bear in mind about the horror is the Great Terror of 37-38, where there were state executions, state-sanctioned executions, in a 2-year period of 681,692 people in 1937 and 1938. And that is the statistics we would associate with a counter-revolution. What about these two categories? To explain this, Trotsky is deploying 2 new categories, the surplus and the machine. The surplus. He sticks with his essential characterization developed in the Russian Revolution. In the Revolution betrayed Russia a degenerated worker state. But the criteria that is deployed elsewhere, that you should come to this conclusion by focusing on the nationalization of the means of production, he hardly mentions in the course of the book. Over and over and over again, he focuses on the control of the surplus product by the bureaucracy. Quote, "The substance of the thermidor was, is, and could not fail to be social in character. It stood for the crystallization of a new privileged stratum, the creation of a new substratum in the economically dominant class." By economically dominant class, he's referring to the working class. He still sees the working class as economically dominant, but he sees a new substratum emerging. There were 2 pretenders to this role, the petty bourgeoisie and the bureaucracy. Possession of the surplus produce opened the bureaucracy's road to power. And he leaves it hanging. When you read that, and when I read this as a young man, I felt it was left hanging as well. I was expecting the next sentence, which is, possession of the surplus produce opened the bureaucracy's road to power, comma, instead of a period, leading to its crystallization as a new ruling class based upon the control of the surplus product, which is what the conclusion we would draw from feudalism, from capitalism, from any other class society. When we see control of the surplus product in the hands of a particular class, we say that's the that defines the nature of the regime. He does not draw that conclusion, but he opens the door to it with his deployment of the notion of surplus. And the other interesting thing about the book is he's very, very hopeful. He says, this process is not finished. The process of the unwinding of the revolution is not finished. What will determine it? Determinant will be the proletarian class consciousness within the cities. And because there still is proletarian class consciousness and proletarian solidarity inside the cities, we still have a worker state. He was not aware of the extent of the destruction of the communist cadre, not just the Trotskyists, all the cadre destroyed. The Trotskyists into the camps, the Bukharinists into the camps, the Zinovievs, the Kamenovists into the camps, and finally, at the end of the period, the Stalinists into the camps. At least 1 million cadre of the Communist Party eliminated in the 1930s. The second one, the machine. He engages in long explorations about Stalin's emergence through the party machine and the negative effects of the party machine. He puts it this way: Stalin took possession of power, not with the aid of personal qualities, but with the aid of an impersonal machine. It was not he who created the machine, but the machine that created him. It's a stark line. The machine creates Stalin. And now we know who Stalin is. That machine, with its force and its authority, was the product of the prolonged and heroic struggle of the Bolshevik Party. He's a loyal Bolshevik. And he says this machine grew out of Lenin and Lenin's idea. When it was controlled by Lenin and animated by the ideas that Lenin personified, it was healthy. But when Lenin was gone and it was no longer animated by the idea, it became just an impersonal machine with its mechanisms. That was the part that Stalin was comfortable with. That was propelled into power. He's presenting a very strong claim, these are Trotsky's words, not mine, that the party machine, disconnected from the idea and without the hand of its creator Lenin, became the perfect breeding ground for authoritarianism dictatorship. He stops there. If you persists with that analysis, it also opens the door to another question. Perhaps there was some problem with the way in which that machine was constructed. Perhaps the machine that was constructed had imperfections, and I think David's touched upon some of these, that we need to think through in a real way. Do I have how many minutes left? 5 minutes left. There are other... I don't want to exaggerate this. I think people should read the book for themselves and look at those ideas, the surplus of the machine. Trotsky is orthodox. He is a defender of Lenin and a defender of the Russian Revolution. But he's a critical orthodox, and he's an engaged intellectual who's really trying to figure this thing out. There are other areas where Trotsky is carving out new territory. I'll just mention a couple. First, he does not shy away. He's a loyal Leninist, but he does not shy away from some of the problems associated with Lenin's practice. He brings to light what Rosa Luxemburg called the muddy wave of Bolshevik expropriations, by which the Bolshevik Party financed itself in the period of time after 1905. He does it dispassionately. It's hard to be dispassionate about it. It is bank robberies, extortions, kidnapping, and the seduction of at least one heiress. He asks himself a question. He condemns it. He says, why would Lenin engage in such activities? Even when he was opposed in that by many members of his party, he couldn't resist the temptation. It had a smack of adventurism to it that was not usually part of Lenin's makeup, but came out at this time. Once again, read it for yourself in the book. It's something that we don't like talking about in the Leninist tradition, but it's worth talking about as well. He also deals with the war on Poland. The war on Poland, which was a catastrophe for the Russian regime. Poland invaded Russia, 1920. Russia pushed back the Polish army to the border, the historic ethnographic border between Poland and Russia, and then a debate opened up in the Bolshevik Party. Karl Radek, Leon Trotsky said, stop here. There will be no liberation of the Polish workers from the bayonets of the Russian army. The Russian army is not perceived as liberators by the people of Poland. The Russian army is perceived as the agent of oppression. Poland had just emerged from independence from various different empires, one of which was the Tsarist Empire. Lenin, in a secret speech, which he said must be withheld from the newspapers, after the fact, said, we discussed amongst ourselves that Poland needed to be probed with bayonets in order to see if it was ripe for socialist revolution. Trotsky, even though he was the commander of the Red Army, was not listened to in his objections to this war. The war proceeded. It almost cost the revolution at that moment. The gates to war, the army was the army collapsed, and he deals with this in this book. He doesn't shy away from this as a negative policy adopted by the Bolshevik Party at the time. 2 other points. 2 minutes. 1 point. 1. The book needs to be seen in its context, and Souverin's book. They're both damaged. They both use language that is unacceptable in the 21st century. They're damaged what I would call Orientalism, in the sense of for instance, at one point Stalin is characterized as being Oriental, lazy like an Oriental. It's a racist term, and it has to be seen. We have to not shy away from the fact that this language is used. We have to know that it's Orientalist, and we have to see it in its context. They're not as bad as Lenin on this. If you read Lenin's collected works up to 1914, his use of that kind of language is much more extreme than either Souverin or Trotsky. They are people who are marked by their own time and are working within their own time. It's something to know and put in its own context. Conclusion in the last minute. I mentioned Boris Souverin. One of Boris Souverin's best friends was Isaac Babel. Isaac Babel was the great poet and short story writer who chronicled the invasion of Poland, and whose short stories were troubling to the people of Russia, but very popular to the people of Russia in the 1920s until he was suppressed. He was shot in 1940 and thrown into a communal grave. We did not know about that until 1954. But in 1934, before the worst of the forced collectivization problems had hit, before the expulsion of tens of thousands from Leningrad, before the Great Terror of 1937, Babel returned to Paris to visit his family after an absence of 3 years. Talking with his friend Yuri Avankov, he said, I have a family, a wife, and a daughter. I love them and have to provide for them. Under no circumstances do I want them to return to Soviet land. They must remain here in freedom. But what about myself? Should I return to our proletarian revolution? Revolution indeed. It disappeared. The proletariat, it flew off like an old buggy with a leaky roof that's lost its wheels. Now it's the central committees that are pushing forward. They'll be more effective. They don't need wheels. They have machine guns instead. All the rest is clear and needs no further commentary. Given the fact that Isaac Babel is another name who has disappeared from history, I thought it might be appropriate to give him the last word in this talk. That's it. There you go.
Okay, what do I do with this?
You clip it to your sweater.
Pardon me. Okay. Sound level? Okay. Well, it's an honor to be discussing this historical topic with my friends here on the panel. We have a common general view of the shape of the Russian Revolution, of its rise, decline, and fall. I have a different analytic approach than Paul and David. However, I hope that the burden of what I say today may be to enlarge somewhat the area of agreement and possible joint research. Now, I have reshaped my written paper as a response to what Paul has said today. He was very kind to give me his written submission in advance. And so I would like to take up in reverse order the two questions he raised about the relationship of Bolshevism to Leninism, and then about the question of the surplus and Trotsky's final writings on the Soviet Union. Now, in the first half of his book, the part that was published long ago, Trotsky argues that Stalin before 1917 was a committee man par excellence, that is what's called in Russian a praktik, a political empiricist, one who, quote, reacted with indifference and subsequently with contempt towards the emigres, towards the foreign center made up of Lenin and his close comrades in exile. Now, Trotsky points to Lenin's statement in 1905 that there was a sickness in the party and sort of projects that sickness over the entire period leading into 1917. And he then comments, the illness was the high-handedness of the political machine, the beginning of bureaucracy. Now here you find the basis for a suggestion that the subsequent bureaucratization under Stalin was related to what went before. Yet in reading Trotsky's words, the context must be kept in mind. The Bolshevik local leaders under Tsarism, the praktiki, were not office-proud, privileged officials. They were activists on the run from severe and unrelenting repression. Trotsky tells us that they spent half their time, on average, in jail. Extreme caution in consulting and selecting colleagues was a necessity for them. These were the rules of the konspiratia, that is, the rules for survival in the revolutionary underground. So when you talk of bureaucracy in that context, it's a little different. The rise of mass workers' struggles in 1905 eased the pressures of illegality and permitted the party to function more democratically and inclusively, and Lenin was among the first to see this and insist on it. And the party did change only to endure a new onslaught of Tsarist repression in 1907 and after. Now, in another part, elsewhere, Trotsky states that the political machine of the Bolshevik Party prior to 1917 was petty bourgeois in its origins and conditions of life, and that Stalin expressed the conservative inclinations of this party machine. In Trotsky's views, after the Russian February 1917 revolution,
the apparatus was steering the party in a conservative direction and towards political liquidation into the Mensheviks. The party was then redeemed only by the arrival of Lenin, whom Trotsky deemed the leader of genius. Now, 400 pages later on in the book, in the part that has just been published, Trotsky goes over this material again and gives it a different slant and a different coloration. Trotsky here repudiates his 1904 writings and affirms that the Bolsheviks did achieve before 1917 a fruitful balance of democracy and centralism. The violation of this balance was not a logical result of Lenin's organizational principles, but the political consequence of the changed balance of forces, and he means after the revolution, between the party and the class. Revolutionary centralism, which is how he characterizes the pre-1917 party, was transformed into bureaucratic centralism. So here the overriding cause of Stalinist degeneration was not inherent in Bolshevism, he states, but was the pressure of objective circumstances. Now, when we compare these two passages, what strikes me is the discrepancy, which is a warning that what we are dealing with here is not a book, but a manuscript developed in patches. There are many such false starts and repetitions in the manuscript, and what Trotsky has left us is something that he never was granted the opportunity to do a consistent political editing in which such repetitions and false starts could be removed. And so I find it hard to judge his final opinion. To my mind, Trotsky's, well, I should say, I have a certain personal contact with Trotsky's views on this because of his work with the North American Trotskyists in the 1930s. I was not there, but I knew many of them. They talked to us, and there's a record of this. In that period, which was about twice as long as his participation in the Bolshevik central leadership, in that period, it seems to me, Trotsky's orientation was to the practici, and that he had a skeptical attitude towards the theorists. So take that for what it's worth. Perhaps there's more to it. Now, I find the approach of the bureaucratic and conservative characteristics of the Bolshevik leadership implausible. As Trotsky writes elsewhere in the manuscript, in an entirely different context, how is it possible that such a fatally flawed party carried out the October Revolution? Now, the most often heard answer to that objection is that the party was transformed by Lenin after his arrival in April 1917. Rearmed is usually the word. Now, this interpretation is widely held by those who are in the official Moscow tradition, also academic historians, and also by the Trotskyist tradition that I come from. But it's been recently strongly contested by Lars Lee and by others, Eric Blanc, and there are rebuttals to this, and I've been trying to post it all on my website, and I think that in discussing this question, it's worthwhile to take a look at this more recent research. There's new material in it. The next installment, and this is an advertisement, is an examination of what Trotsky actually said and did in 1917, which appears on the surface not to correspond to what he wrote in 1940 in the book under discussion. Now, I'm just going to leave the address of my website right there. Take it or leave it. Now, was the Soviet Union no longer a worker state? Publication of the manuscript enables us to test the hypothesis that Trotsky, in his final months, was retreating from his long-held contention that the Soviet Union, under Stalin's totalitarian dictatorship, remained in some sense a worker state. For my part, I find his comments on the Soviet Union and its ruling layer to be consistent with his previous position, particularly regarding its character as a bureaucratic caste rather than as a new ruling class. Now, Paul has made the useful suggestion here that we examine Trotsky's use in the manuscript of the concept that the Soviet ruling layer has control over disposition of the social surplus. Paul sees this as the defining characteristic of a ruling class, which in turn is a marker, as Trotsky was well aware, for the theory that the Soviet worker state was dead. Now, I found 3 passages in the book, the new book, the big one, in which Trotsky speaks of this question of the ruling layer having possession and disposition of the social surplus. In each case that I found, the context was clear. It was the early and mid-1920s, the first years of the new economic policy. Each of these passages explicitly counterposed the control of the surplus by the bureaucracy to that of the newly resurgent capitalist forces. The following comment on the year 1921 is typical. It's very pithy, but it's all there. The economy revived. A small surplus appeared. Naturally, it was concentrated in the cities and was at the disposal of the ruling strata. Now, this is far removed from an announcement that in 1921, when Trotsky still led the Soviet state, it was already capitalist in nature. Surely, if Trotsky had reached that conclusion in his last years, he would have said so. True, Lenin did speak then of the Soviet economy, not the state, as state capitalist in character. Trotsky never used the term. The thought is developed in the 4th Congress of the Communist International, by the way, where they both speak. Okay. We must also check the date of composition. Does it in fact contain Trotsky's final comments on the Soviet state under Stalin? Now, Trotsky did not work on the manuscript during the last 3 months, that we know. But we must go further back. During the last year of Trotsky's life, a series of events related to the outbreak of World War challenged all Marxists, including Trotsky, to review their analysis of the Soviet Union. These events included the Stalin-Hitler Pact, the Soviet seizure of the eastern marches of Poland, the structural assimilation of these Polish regions, including, although details became available only later, the extension to them of Stalin's murder machine, the Soviet occupation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and their incorporation in the Soviet Union, and a Soviet war against Finland. According to Trotsky, such actions were justifiable in a formal sense as measures of military defense of a worker state. But in terms of the dynamics of the world workers' movement, he contended that they were erroneous and that the Soviet Union lost more than it gained. Now, a debate on these issues flared up among Trotsky's supporters in the Socialist Workers' Party, and Trotsky took part actively. His writings, running from September 1939 to August 1940, fill a good-sized book. It's called In Defense of Marxism. There is no reference to any of these events in the discussion around them in Trotsky's, around these issues in Trotsky's Stalin manuscript that we have before us now. Could it be that he had just not got to that point in his manuscript? No, it couldn't, because his manner of composition was to work on all parts of the book simultaneously, assembling materials and writing fragments that were then dropped into folders corresponding to the chapters of the projected book. And so there certainly was material there that in which this would have come up. But the whole question of the World War is simply not there. Neither is my next page. Clearly, he stopped work on this manuscript a year before his death, and that's why the war is not mentioned. But what then are his final thoughts on the question of the Soviet state? Now, there was an immediate crisis with the outbreak of war in the world Trotskyist movement on this question. It shook preconceptions of what the Soviet Union's role in world politics was. Trotsky responded immediately in September 12, 1939, and this little sentence is interesting because it's by Trotsky in English, and it's unedited. He just sent it right off. Who says that the USSR is no more a degenerate worker state, but a new social formation, should clearly say what he adds to our political conclusions. The central political issue, as he saw it, was not what to call the Soviet Union, but where it stands in the conflicts with imperialist states, but where we should stand on its conflicts with the imperialist states. Suppose that Hitler turns his weapons against the East, Trotsky wrote later that month, as Hitler did do a little over a year later. The Fourth International, made up of Trotsky supporters worldwide, would, in his opinion, adopt as the most urgent task of the hour the military resistance against Hitler. While arms in hand, they deal blows to Hitler, they will at the same time conduct revolutionary propaganda against Stalin, preparing his overthrow at the next and perhaps very near stage. After more than 6 months of debate, Trotsky wrote a summary comment in which he called on socialists to explain to the world working class that no matter what crimes Stalin may be guilty of, we cannot permit world imperialism to crush the Soviet Union, reestablish capitalism, and convert the land of the October Revolution into a colony. Elsewhere, he speaks of the Soviet Union as a land in which the October Revolution still lives in the hearts of working people, and that was a precious acquisition. A month later, in May 28th, that's about 2 months before his death, he repeated this thought in a manifesto on the war. It includes a section, Defense of the USSR, that states in part, "The crimes of the Kremlin oligarchy do not strike off the agenda the question of the existence of the USSR. Its defeat in the World War would signify not merely the overthrow of totalitarian bureaucracy, but the liquidation of the new forms of property, the collapse of the first experiment in a planned economy, and the transformation of the entire country into a colony. That is, the handing over to imperialism of colossal natural resources with which it would gain a respite until the next World War. Neither the peoples of the USSR nor the world working class as a whole care for such an outcome." Trotsky's opponents in that debate embraced a third camp position of de facto neutrality regarding the conflicts between the USSR and the imperialist states. They maintained that when Hitler's forces invaded the USSR the following year, unleashing a genocidal war against the Jews and Eastern European peoples, they continued to maintain that stance. The position seems counterintuitive. Sincere socialists seem to have been caught in a doctrinal trap. The question has been reposed in Europe today, and this relates to Ruslan's comments this morning. In the rise of far-right movements in many countries, including Ukraine, whose historical lineage goes back to Hitler's allies in the Nazi-dominated countries of Europe. For them, Hitler's war against the United States may seem to be misguided, although Ruslan tells us some of them are for that too. But his crusade in Eastern Europe was a just war against communist barbarism. The stance of neutrality on that conflict, on that seems inappropriate to me. Reference to the horrendous human cost of Stalinist repression does not help us here. Trotsky affirmed that the Stalinist system of rule was similar to that of Hitler. He used the word totalitarian of both and did not underestimate the human toll. The question was whether working people could make use of the Soviet state and army in resistance to fascism and in opening the road to revolution. One historical description describes how in the first month of the war there was a wavering on the Soviet side, and there were 85,000 desertions from the Red Army in the first month. And then that ceased, and the army firmed up and held and fought through the war with the support and participation of almost all working people in the Soviet Union. In this regard, Trotsky stressed, we see, during the last months of his life, that the goal of Hitlerite Germany in the impending war against the Soviet Union would not be merely to conquer it and lay claim to its resources, but to subject it to a vast project of settler colonialism. The Hitlers used a figure of 31 million who were to be deported and left to perish in order to make room for German settlers. For us in Canada, it has a familiar ring. Germany's rulers had floated this project many decades previously, terming it a quest for Lebensraum, that is, living space. In 1914, they integrated it into their war aims. The Nazis were not original. They picked up on that project. They included it in their foundational documents, and they imbued it with their characteristically aggressive racist extremism. As Marxist theorist Ernest Mandel later pointed out, the Nazis' genocidal methods were not new. They had been used before against peoples of Asia, Africa, and America. What was new and what was so horrifying was that they were used against the peoples of Europe, including relatives of mine and many of others of us here. And that has given the Holocaust its particularly strong ring for us. Now, this somewhat overlooked anti-colonial thread in Trotsky's final statements on the defense of the Soviet Union provide a framework within Marxists who differ in their sociological characterization of the Soviet Union may possibly find common ground in their assessment of the historic clash of German fascism with Soviet Union. And so I offer that as an addition to our assessment of Trotsky's final thoughts on the Soviet Union. Thank you.
Thank you. So I am tasked with a privilege of being able to provide a few points of discussion before we open this up for conversation. So let me start by saying that I think we've heard three absolutely outstanding, very thoughtful, very well-researched papers on a very important moment in the history of the world and in the history of socialist conversation. I have been struck over the years that I've paid attention to the Russian Revolution with how the discourse has changed in terms of radical activism. And I know for the contemporary generation of students that I teach and activists that I'm involved in who are younger than me, which is a good thing, there is far less sort of central focus and concern about the detail and the events of the Russian Revolution than there was for my generation. I radicalized in the late 60s and 70s. Commonly, conversations that I've had over the years with all of the panelists, we didn't need to say, do you care about the Russian Revolution to one another? We started with that position. And I've been spending a lot of time thinking about why that has changed and how it has changed. David said that how people look at the Russian Revolution depends on different theoretical assumptions, and I think that's definitely true. I would add to that I think there are different contexts about how we look at it, and there are also different affective assumptions and different epistemologies of how we look at it. What questions are we asking and why do we care about this revolution more or differently than perhaps the Haitian Revolution or the Mexican Revolution or what's considered the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s or what's considered to be the indigenous rights revolution that's happening right now as we speak. And I don't have clear answers to that, but I do think that this conversation is taking place within that type of a context. So I'll add a couple of contexts within that. First of all, I think the question of how we read and how we understand the Russian Revolution is difficult. It's difficult because we have had very uneven access to story writing. The fact that the translation of Trotsky's unfinished final work is only coming out in the last year is indicative of this. The contributions that John Riddell has done of translating for the first time into English texts from the Communist International over the last few years is indicative of this. And the fact that there are different ways of reading the history that David has referred to, depending on things that are considered myths and what are considered truths, has also changed over time. So my thinking is that I come at this now from the point of view of socialist feminism or intersectional feminism and look at the Russian Revolution again with different eyes. And also from the point of view of thinking about this in terms of scholarship, is it not possible to have diverse and different interpretations of the Russian Revolution, of Trotsky's writings, of Trotsky's views, and for us to rest comfortably with that pluralism? Is there a need for this to find a kind of teleological conclusion where we have what we think of as the definitive interpretation? And I'm not saying that from a sort of multiple postmodern points that all opinions are equal. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm suggesting that perhaps we are in a work in progress. And what we need to recognize is that academic discourse has expelled much discussion of socialist ideas. I mean, certainly during the 50s and during the 60s in parts of Canada, people lost their jobs for trying to study this stuff. Much of the discussion around issues of the Russian Revolution have taken place in non-academic party formations or political circles, which have been under-resourced and marginalized and had very difficult access to even study groups, conversations, you know, who's in charge of ideas, translations, and so on and so forth. And there has been a tendency, certainly that I've seen in my history, that conceptions of working together in practice have tended to be assumed to mean that we agree with each other on all sorts of details. So if you take the concept of what Lenin and the Bolsheviks understood as democratic centralism, for instance, it meant that there was maximum democracy and disagreement in conversation, but common practice. My experience has been in many of the political organizations that I've been in and through, that has been interpreted as we don't actually do very much in practice, so we better agree with what we think. Sort of centralism in thought rather than centralism in action, which is exactly the opposite of freedom of speech and exactly the opposite of a pluralistic discourse. So I'm not suggesting that there is not an ultimate truth in our conversation, but I do think that we could potentially be at a moment where we are just starting to figure out what kind of multiple interpretations will lead to a truth that is actually useful for future action and for going forward. So, for example, I am rethinking the question of, is Marxism Eurocentric? This is a bit of a plug for my talk this afternoon, where the question that Paul Kellogg raised about Orientalism as a historic feature, I appreciate you raising that, but my conclusion is that time doesn't necessarily help that. So while we can say, yes, someone is a product of their time, there are contemporary Marxist theorists, Bill Warren, Francis Widdowson, who are no less Orientalist, I would argue, in a contemporary period than a historic period. So to assume that time is an explanation for that feels to me unsatisfying. At the same time, John's important point that Trotsky did not finish his work and that we can't really anticipate exactly how he would have finished it should lead us to have an open conversation rather than trying to be Trotsky's brain in the past tense, I think. One of the things we do know is we don't have a lot of inspiring models about how to have a pluralistic conversation on the left. Certainly in terms of the context of this text, and I'll close here, I mean, Trotsky was trying to figure this out and writing a biography of Stalin at the time that he was exiled, isolated, and living under threat of death. And actually, his death was the product of an assassination from his former comrade's institution and organization of Joseph Stalin, where he was assassinated violently at his desk while he was writing this text. So literally, this conversation is dripping in blood. Literally. That could not be a more negative example for what we want to have as debates among comrades. I mean, we do not need to have a conception that we all have to agree on thought. We do have to have a conception that ultimately we will agree on common action. So I'll leave it there, and I'll put back my hat as chair. So we have this little microphone that we'll pass around. So yeah, so what I'll suggest is that it's now your turn. We open this up for conversation. Why don't we'll take a few comments, and then we'll send it back to our panel. So yes.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting panel. I want to make one quick comment and ask a question. The comment is this. In any clandestine organization, centralism and lack of democracy is just a practical necessity. But when you work in open public spaces, it has all kinds of terrible possibilities, including self-interested, petty bureaucrats who will use it. This has happened time and time again, even in small organizations. Stalin, in my opinion, was the epitome, the maximum expression of this. My opinion. Second, my question, is this morning Ruslan used a quote from Revolution Betrayed about the absence of inheritance was an obstacle for the bureaucracy becoming a new social class because it couldn't reproduce itself as a class. So this is my question to the three panelists, is how do you respond to that point that Trotsky made in The Revolution Betrayed, which I think is a key issue in whether or not the bureaucracy had ever become a social class before the implosion of the Soviet Union?
Well, first I want to ask a question. I'm a bit concerned when Paul presents the book Stalin as Trotsky's final word, and John says he didn't work on it for the last year of his life, which also happened to be the first year of the World War II. So there's a discrepancy there that I think needs to be clarified before we go too far in how the book is presented and discussed. Also, I think it's very important, if we're going to talk about Lenin's views as, I don't know the word to describe it, your comment, Paul, about his pre-1914 views. I mean, Lenin was the great liberator of the early 20th century through the policy of national self-determination of the early Soviet republics. So let's couple that with any critique that we might have of language or even policy prior to 1914, because no one can be held accountable in the abstract for views they would have had at any point in their lives. Lenin was the great liberator of the 20th century, and this is thoroughly documented in Jeremy Smith's book on the Bolsheviks and the national question. So that's the phrase that I use for him. I'm concerned, and this has been the events of the past 3.5 years in Ukraine that have sparked that concern, with I think the idealization of the early Russian Revolution. And I think that that's become more problematic even, because with events in Ukraine, we're seeing some similarities to the beginning of World War II and the attack on the Soviet Union. Where do we stand when the imperialists wage a war against the Soviet Union in 1941, and they're building towards war against the Russian Federation in the current times? And the first 3 years of the Russian Revolution I was kind of taught this even, although not so strongly, I think, as in the International Socialist Current, of the first 3 and 4 years of Russian Revolution being a great heroic period of Soviet democracy. I think that period was a curse on the Russian Revolution. They had no control over this, but they had a foreign intervention and the organized counter-revolution of the Tsarist generals. And this deeply marked, I agree on this, and I think we agree on this deeply marked the early Soviet democracy. And I think, among others, Stephen Cohen's biography of Bukharin for me, it was a revelation to reread it recently. But, so this is a contradiction when apparently the Soviet Union ceased being any kind of socialist republic very early on, and yet the very first years of it, where these terrible incursions on Soviet democracy were imposed from the outside, becomes the ideal. There's a big contradiction there. Finally, I think the whole habit that I think comes with the idealization of the Russian Revolution, of ignoring the period of the new economic policy, because I think the first crime of Stalinism was to abolish the new economic policy. It had not ended its necessity, its historical necessity, and I think there are huge lessons from the new economic policy today for countries like Venezuela, where no one, unless you're Cuba in 1959 and you've got the Soviet Union to provide everything you need, no one can simply ignore the capitalist heritage that any new revolution begins with. And so, I mean, I think there's many reasons to be concerned about how NEP has just disappeared from the discourse. And I've cited 2 of them. So I very much want to see that entire first 15 years span of the Russian Revolution to come back under the political microscope, and we relook at everything anew, because the world has changed, and therefore we have to look at history a little bit in light of the changed circumstances of the present world.
Should we give this back to our panelists while people think about other questions?
In terms of the key points in Trotsky's book, the key issue is not whether or not it was his last book. It was one of his last books. We know this. And the key point is to take the book seriously, epistemologically, for the frameworks that he's trying to develop. And there's 4. Some of them are very, very uncomfortable. So two of them are relatively abstract. The question of the surplus and the machine. The surplus is a theoretical discussion that we can have about the relationship of surplus control by a small group, when does it become a class, etc. It's a very important discussion about how we conceive of class power and class. The other one is the machine, which is historically more difficult but interesting. And his comments are, I mean, I only gave a section of them. His comments about the conservative nature of the apparatchiks in the early days of the Bolshevik Party are devastating. It's a devastating. And the other point that he makes, and he's very clear on this, is that the Bolshevik leaders did not want Stalin to be a member of the Central Committee. Lenin in 1912 couldn't get him elected. He had to be co-opted on later on. So there's a very close, and he doesn't shy away from the very, very close relationship between Lenin. He's very negative towards Stalin, and he's very open about the very close relationship between Lenin and Stalin for a whole period of time, up until right towards Lenin's death, actually. So we need a dispassionate discussion of those 2 ideas, which are complex and interesting, and historically, specifically, we can look at them. There's some that are more difficult and more nasty. The question of ends and means, the way in which Lenin's practice consistently denied a connection between the ends and the means, the means that you use and the ends. Particularly the period of the bank robberies, which was the biggest. Trotsky describes it in his autobiography as the biggest break. The biggest ever divide between himself and Lenin was over the question of Trotsky and Julius Martov and a whole lot of other people and Rosa Luxemburg were completely opposed to the Leninist practice of robbing banks and doing forgeries and kidnappings to finance their operations. They thought it would corrupt the core of the Socialist Party. And that's in the book, and we need to we never talk about it. We need to actually put it on the surface as something. Is there a relationship between ends and means? Rosa Luxemburg says yes. Julius Martov says yes. Trotsky says ambivalently yes, not as clearly as Martov and Luxemburg. And the other one, which is more geopolitical, is the terrible mistake made by Lenin in the invasion of Poland in 1920. where he consciously tried to use the Cossack cavalry to export revolution to Poland in a way that was posed by the Polish section of the party. Knew this was wrong, he didn't listen to it. We had to look at that right in the eye and say, what does this say about the limitations of the notion of world revolution that was contained within Lenin himself? I think in this context, Marcel Liebman's book, Leninism Under Lenin, is extremely important. Because Leninism Under Lenin is a book that written many years ago now, but it talks about a sectarian undercurrent to the Bolshevik early period that had to be overcome through intersection with the mass struggle. And I think that's a very interesting and important framework to put it in. Finally, there was a question asked. Two other points, the state and the NEP. Okay, in terms of, I'll go back to the NEP in a second. The question of inheritance in the state, inheritance and the creation of a class. Brilliant term developed by Colin Barker, 1977-78, called the state as capital. I think if you look at Japan with the Meiji Restoration, you look at Bismarck, German capitalism, and the emergence of it, you can see the state itself acting as a capitalist, or state as, more accurately, state as capital in the accumulation project. That, I think, was going on regardless of whether the bureaucracy had the right to inheritance or not. The issue is not the emergence of individual capitalists. The issue is the emergence of capital-labor relations controlled by a collective body. The collective body in this case was the state. The NEP, thank you for raising the NEP. I think that the destruction of the NEP by Stalin was the essence of the counter-revolution which happened, actually. It was a catastrophe that we need to look at in more detail.
I think I'll just say one thing briefly, and it's really just this thought raised by Abby's comments as discussed, and that's that I think there's obviously a very, very different context for reflecting on the Russian Revolution today compared to the context in which it was discussed in the years after 1968 with the rebirth of an anti-Stalinist, or rebirth of a Marxist left, and particularly within that of an anti-Stalinist Marxist left. And there are a lot of problems with the way that it has been discussed historically. I think now, I guess my hope is that this year, the centenary, would be an opportunity to look back in a way that's really shaped by a recognition of the historical moment that we're in, which is a very different historical moment, than those which come before. So maybe in a more, as to use a phrase that someone used the term of dispassionate sense, right? To try to maybe recognize that there's no immediate political conclusion we're drawing from these kinds of reflections, but nonetheless it can still be of use. And I think the one that I think is potentially useful for the future, that is derived from the reflection that I've tried to offer here, is the question when we think about what a transition towards socialism actually might look like, the danger of holding up the state as it existed 1919, 1920, 1921 as some kind of a model, I think is a real problem. Because I think, as I've argued, I actually think that is not an expression of working class power. I mean, it certainly wasn't yet an expression of a new exploited class either. But that we need to recognize the gulf between the democracy that was created, which was established and held for the first year, and what came after. And the fact that we often look back on and read through the history of the Russian Revolution through the eyes of participants like Lenin and Trotsky, who I would argue did not fully understand the processes that they were actually living through, and therefore understandably didn't recognize the extent to which they were holding power in attempting to defend and spark revolution elsewhere, in spite of the fact that the foundations of that revolution had actually been drastically eroded. It's much more complex than has usually been understood by people who've been inspired by the revolution. So I think looking back critically can be helpful if it helps us to clarify our understanding of what a society in transition towards socialism actually would look like, and what are the conditions that would be required for that to actually take place.
Since time is brief, I agree with Trotsky's analysis of the Soviet Union. I tend not to agree with his analysis of the structures of the Bolshevik Party before 1917. To the antecedents of the October 1917 revolution mentioned by David, I think we should add a major uprising of the Muslim peoples of Central Asia in 1916. Roger discusses, it was mentioned also by Abby, the problem of Orientalist statements by Trotsky or by Lenin, or male chauvinist statements. I think they're significant, should be noted and discussed. I give an example. In the World Congress, someone got up and said, Clara Zetkin's the only man, the only real man in the German Communist Party. Okay, let's not just overlook it. Let's talk about it, what that meant, what that reflected. On the question of centralism, I'd like to have a discussion of what centralism is. I think, what organizations do I belong to that are not Marxist? I'm a member of a choir, I'm a member of a tenants association, I'm a member of various ecological groups. They're all centralists. They're all based on, we make decisions together and we carry them out together. So what is it that's distinctive of Marxist centralism? I leave that with you. Was Russia unique? I think that's really important. I said at the beginning that I think that there's common ground between me and David, that the Russian Revolution, the Soviet state was sublunary. That is, it was deformed from the start. In that sense, I think it's similar to the other attempts to achieve workers' and peasants' power through the 20th century, including the Chinese Revolution. And if we're going to talk about what's the greatest of them all, we've got a debate there. And so I think if we look at it that way, it helps us to understand Russia better too. And that we should stop saying that Russia, Soviet power was from below and all the rest are from above. It's not so clear as all that. And so I think if we don't do this, we're falling into, I don't want to use an epithet, but a Europe-centered approach. You see, take the Russian Revolution, cast aside the peasants, don't worry about the peasants, cast aside the non-Russians. What you're left with, 5% of the population, kind of looks like something we think is familiar to us. Like we know what we're talking about. Working class, a capitalist class, a capitalist state, and so on. But the Russian Revolution was much more than that. It was Asiatic as well as European. It was peasant as well as worker. And if you look at it that way, you see its kinship with all the other things that followed throughout the... And so rather than saying Russia's the most important of them all, I think it should be viewed as a totality, the whole century of efforts. Thanks.
So I have the job as chair to look at the clock, and it's actually 12:30, and I know some people have to get to somewhere else. So I'm sad to say we're going to have to end the discussion here for the time being. Please join me in thanking these three wonderful presentations and these speakers. And thank you all for your participation. We'll look forward to more discussion through the rest of the conference.